World leaders are reacting to the wave of tariffs announced by Donald Trump last night. The US president imposed a baseline tariff of 10% on all imports into the US, with even higher rates for what he calls the worst offenders. With me to go through all of that is Raoul Ruparel, director of the Boston Consulting Group Centre for Growth and former senior advisor to Theresa May. Raoul, first of all, can you walk us through what exactly was announced in the Rose Garden last night?
Sure. Well, I think there are a few things announced. To start off with, there's the basic tariff across all countries and all imports, which is 10%. You then have an additional reciprocal tariff for individual countries based on their level of trade and particularly their trade deficit they operate with the United States. And then you also had tariffs on on cars of 25%. So sort of those three elements were the key elements announced last night.
And as you say, these tariffs have been described as reciprocal or retaliatory. Have we heard from any countries in response to what has been announced? Have any of them perhaps threatened to strike out with their own new tariffs?
Well, there's several countries that have already said previously that they will look to retaliate or have already retaliated, China being a key example, Canada obviously being one, and the EU has set out a number of potential measures. I don't think we've yet seen exactly how different countries will react and what they will do to this specific announcement. I think the announcement was probably on the worst end of expectations for several countries in terms of the size of the tariffs that are levied. And so I think a number of countries will be considering their options and their ability to retaliate, but also the ability potentially to negotiate down from this level and reduce the tariff impact they're facing.
And as you say, there was a really varied application of these new tariffs. We saw President Donald Trump bring out this big scorecard last night in the Rose Garden. Who would you describe as the biggest winners or losers in this situation?
Well, in terms of those countries being hit hardest with the highest levels of tariffs, I think the ones to call out are probably China, obviously, where you have a very high reciprocal tariff on top of already existing tariffs that the Trump administration has levied. I think particularly countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, and others where we have seen trade moving from China to these countries, then into the US. I think those countries have been hit particularly hard. And Asia in general, I think, has generally been hit harder with the reciprocal tariffs than other parts of the world. In terms of those that have been hit least bad, I think the UK is probably up there. You know, we faced just the 10% tariff, the universal tariff that was levied. I think that's because obviously we don't run a significant goods trade deficit with the US. I think a number of other countries have done okay. I think it's a bit unclear in terms of the Canada and Mexico impacts. But I think generally the UK can look at this and feel it's on the lower end of the impact in terms of where things have ended up overall.
We did already know that the automotive sector was going to face an additional tariff from today as well. But are any other industry bosses perhaps feeling a bit worried waking up this morning?
Well, I think there certainly will be some. I mean, obviously, steel and aluminium tariffs are also ones we know about, but they will continue to be concerning. I think there are several other sectors in the UK that are potentially exposed. Pharmaceuticals is one. They are subject to the universal tariff that has been announced, the 10%. I think for levels above that, in terms of reciprocal tariffs, pharmaceuticals are actually exempt. So for other countries, I think there will be a bit of a sigh of relief in that sense in terms of the impact on the pharmaceutical sector. But in the UK, because we don't have that additional reciprocal tariff, we're just facing this universal tariff, which does seem to capture pharmaceuticals. So I think those are the kind of key sectors. And there are sectors that just have significant trade with the US, chemicals being one for the UK. So there are a number of sectors that will be looking at this and considering the impacts. But I think when you look at the responses, for the most part, businesses saying they don't want to see retaliation from the UK. They are keen to try and minimise the impact and keen for the government to continue to work towards striking some kind of agreement to lower the tariffs eventually.
And of course, in your previous work, the UK's exit from the European Union was a major theme. We've seen the EU hit with a 20% rate versus the UK's 10%, as you just mentioned. So have people who were in favour of Brexit been proven right in this moment?
Well, look, I think it is a fact that the UK is in a slightly different position here vis-a-vis the US. We have a different type of trade with the US compared to much of Europe. 70% of our exports to the US are services, so aren't impacted by these tariffs. So only 30% are goods that are affected here. We don't run a large trade deficit in goods like some other countries, for example, Germany. And also in terms of growth of exports, since I think pre-COVID, UK's exports in goods to the US have fallen by 10%, whereas those of the Eurozone have increased by 45%. So it's been a very different path in terms of the reliance on external US demand. That's not necessarily a positive thing, also, obviously, in terms of the fact we haven't been exporting lots to the US, but it does mean that we are less reliant currently on the US as a source of external demand growth than maybe some European countries. So for all those reasons, the UK is in a different position. And yes, the fact that we are able to negotiate directly with the US and be treated separately from the EU in this instance is obviously beneficial. We'll see over time whether that can result in any particular additional deals being done and any reduction in tariffs. But obviously, there's still the wider impact of Brexit to consider, and this alone doesn't necessarily offset that. And then there are still going to be complications, if the EU does retaliate, which, it is said is potentially likely, then that will create potential complications around Northern Ireland. And, there will also be questions about whether the UK aligns more closely with the EU or with the US or other countries that are retaliating. So, at the moment, it's definitely beneficial that the UK has been able to carve its own path, but there are still, potential complications to come down the line.
And looking ahead, not only in the UK, but further afield, some economists have warned that these new tariffs could risk pushing prices up and also potentially even a global recession. If that is the case, why is President Trump so keen on pursuing this as a policy?
Well, I think starting with the impacts broadly on the global economy, it does look to be a potential slowdown in growth. It depends, obviously, in terms of what happens with retaliation and the broader potential escalation of this trade conflict. But I think if you look at markets' reaction today, borrowing costs for the US and other countries, including the UK, have come down. The pound and the euro have appreciated against the dollar. And this suggests to me that actually, while they think there might be some higher inflation in the US, the slower growth is dominating that effect, hence why US borrowing costs are down. And so I think actually the effect is more likely to be a slowdown and therefore a deflationary rather than inflationary at this stage. And so for the UK, the combination of that plus a more expensive pound, which is also likely to be deflationary and potentially slow economic growth, or at least export. I think that is the direction the pressure is in at the moment. So more of a slowdown than a potential pickup in terms of inflation. And then stepping back, why is President Trump pursuing this? Well, we've heard a lot of different rationales in terms of what he's trying to achieve. In his speech last night, he mentioned increasing revenue from tariffs, which could then allow him to make some of the tax cuts permanent and undertake other policies by generating new sources of revenue from these tariffs. We've also heard him talk about increasing investment, particularly in manufacturing in the US, and getting companies to move their plants or manufacturing or supply chains to the US to try to increase the US manufacturing sector and jobs in that space. And then we've also heard him talk about striking special deals and trying to achieve other geopolitical or international goals with these tariffs as a negotiating leverage. So there are so many different potential options of what he's trying to achieve. I think the broad aim, of course, he seems to be wanting to achieve is to correct the trade deficit, which he sees as a negative for the US, and particularly try to rebuild some of the manufacturing jobs that have over time moved from the US to other countries. But obviously, trying to discern exactly which of the number of aims he set out he wants to achieve is tricky.
And many people around the world will be waiting anxiously to see whether or not this is a gamble that pays off. Raoul Ruparel from the Boston Consulting Group, thank you so much.
Thank you.